This tax system will destroy the greatest civilization on Earth and plunge the world into 1,000 years of darkness. Right now, in 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian thinks he's saving the Roman Empire with the most comprehensive tax reform in history. He calls it the restoration of order. He has no idea he's about to create the economic catastrophe that will bring down Rome itself. What you're about to discover is how the empire that ruled the known world for 8 centuries was destroyed not by barbarian invasions, but by its own tax collectors. How good intentions to fund the military created a system so brutal it made citizens welcome foreign conquest, and why the Romans who saw their civilization collapsing still couldn't stop the machine they'd created. The year is 285 AD, and the Roman Empire is hemorrhaging money. Picture the imperial treasury in Rome. Massive bronze doors that once secured rooms overflowing with gold now protecting nearly empty vaults. The stone floors, polished smooth by centuries of heavy coin chests being dragged across them, now echo with the footsteps of worried officials counting and recounting dwindling reserves. What Emperor Diocletian didn't understand was that the empire's financial crisis wasn't about collecting more taxes. It was about having destroyed the economy that generated tax revenue in the first place. But the imperial bureaucracy had grown so large that it consumed more resources than entire provinces could produce. The crisis was accelerating beyond anyone's comprehension. Roman armies on the frontiers hadn't been paid in months. Soldiers were deserting not to the enemy, but to become the very bandits they were supposed to fight. Germanic tribes weren't just raiding Roman territory. They were being invited in by Roman citizens who preferred barbarian rule to Roman tax collection. The government is about to make the crisis infinitely worse. Diocletian's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Create a tax system so comprehensive, so efficient, so inescapable that every person and every transaction in the empire would contribute to imperial revenues. No one would escape. Nothing would be exempt. This comprehensive approach will backfire catastrophically. The Imperial Council spent months designing what they called the perfect system. Taxes on land, taxes on trade, taxes on professions, taxes on movement between cities, even taxes on the tools used to pay other taxes. Every aspect of economic life would be documented, regulated, and taxed. The sound of the new tax system being implemented was the scratching of thousands of reed pens on papyrus scrolls. In every town across the empire, newly appointed tax assessors were creating detailed inventories of everything that could be taxed. The scraping sound of styluses on wax tablets continued day and night as bureaucrats recorded every cow, every workshop, every cart, every business transaction. What Romans were hearing was the sound of their economic freedom disappearing. The new tax code required documentation for every aspect of daily life. Farmers had to report not just their harvest, but their seed purchases, their tool repairs, their livestock breeding. Merchants needed permits to travel, licenses to trade, and documentation proving they'd paid taxes in their previous location. The bureaucratic machinery was consuming itself. For every denarius collected in taxes, the empire was spending 2 denarii on the tax collection system. Entire legions of clerks, assessors, inspectors, and auditors were spreading across the provinces like locusts, each one requiring salary, housing, food, and protection. The system is about to become self-perpetuating. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, the empire's second largest city, merchants were discovering that the new tax requirements made trade nearly impossible. The cost of compliance, hiring scribes, obtaining permits, paying for inspections, often exceeded the profit margin on goods. Many simply stopped trading altogether. The scratching of pens recording economic decline would soon become the sound of civilization unraveling. Every transaction now required documentation. Every profession needed licensing. Every movement of goods demanded inspection. The Roman economy, which had thrived on flexibility and efficiency, was being strangled by red tape. While bureaucrats celebrated their organizational triumph, they were actually documenting the empire's suicide. The sound of imperial administration had become indistinguishable from the sound of economic collapse. The new tax offices reeked of fear mixed with parchment and ink, a sour, acrid smell that became synonymous with imperial authority. Citizens approaching these buildings could smell the anxiety sweat of taxpayers mixed with the musty odour of thousands of documents and the metallic tang of counting coins that would never return to the local economy. Diocletian's inspectors carried the smell of the road, leather, horse sweat and dust as they moved from town to town, assessing and reassessing property values. But underneath was something else, the smell of economic death. These men were cataloguing the destruction of prosperity with meticulous precision. "We have created the most efficient system of resource extraction in human history," wrote Diocletian's finance minister in 286 AD. "Every asset, every transaction, every economic activity now contributes to imperial strength." What he was actually smelling was the decay of the economic foundation that had made the empire possible. The decision has been made. There's no going back. The smell of the new tax system, that mixture of bureaucratic sweat, parchment and fear, would spread across the empire faster than any plague. It carried with it the death of local economies, the collapse of trade networks, and the end of the prosperity that had made Roman civilization the envy of the world. But this systematic approach will trigger the empire's total collapse. Tax collectors moved through the provinces like a conquering army, leaving behind the smell of abandoned workshops, closed markets, and depopulated towns. What they thought was the scent of efficiency was actually the stench of civilizational suicide. By 290 AD, the texture of Roman economic life had changed completely. What once felt like a thriving marketplace economy now felt like a prison. Citizens couldn't touch money without wondering if the transaction was being observed, couldn't handle goods without calculating the tax burden, couldn't even till their own fields without feeling the weight of imperial documentation requirements. The physical sensation of economic activity had become oppressive. Roman merchants described the feeling of conducting business as like trying to breathe underwater. Every transaction required multiple approvals, every movement of goods demanded inspection, every business decision involved calculating not just profit and loss, but compliance costs that often exceeded the value of the goods themselves. Families were feeling the texture of poverty for the first time in generations. In Gaul, previously prosperous farming communities found their hands growing rough not from honest labour, but from desperately searching for wild foods as their crops were seized for taxes. The smooth bronze coins that had symbolised Roman prosperity were being replaced by the rough feel of barter goods, pottery shards, pieces of cloth, anything that couldn't be easily taxed. The first signs of resistance are appearing. What Romans were touching was the collapse of the monetary economy. When taxes consumed more than total production, people stopped using money altogether. The empire had created a system so comprehensive that it destroyed the thing it was trying to tax, economic activity itself. Remember Diocletian's goal to create comprehensive taxation? The citizens were abandoning the economy entirely rather than participating in their own destruction. The feeling of Roman citizenship, once a source of pride, now felt like wearing shackles. People described the physical sensation of being Roman as carrying invisible chains that grew heavier every day. The taste of Roman civilization was changing. The wine that had flowed freely in taverns across the empire now carried the bitter aftertaste of tax documentation. Every amphora required permits, every transaction demanded records. What had once tasted like prosperity now tasted like bureaucratic control. Citizens were tasting poverty for the first time in centuries. Bread, the foundation of Roman diet, was now rationed not because of scarcity, but because the tax on grain made it unaffordable for the people who grew it. Farmers were eating the coarse, bitter meal reserved for animals, while their wheat was shipped to Rome to feed tax collectors. The tax system was consuming its own foundation. In Britannia, salt, essential for preserving food through winter, became so heavily taxed that entire communities faced starvation. The taste of salt, once taken for granted, became a luxury that reminded people of what they'd lost. Children grew up never knowing the taste of properly preserved meat. The addiction is spreading through all levels of society, but the addiction wasn't to substances, it was to tax revenue. Imperial bureaucrats had become addicted to the power of comprehensive control, even as that control destroyed the economy they were trying to manage. Every year they needed more revenue to fund the system that collected revenue. The medicine designed to preserve the empire was slowly destroying the civilization that made the empire possible. Provincial governors described the taste of local wine as souring, not from spoilage, but from the knowledge that half the vineyard's production would be seized before harvest. the sweetness of Roman life was being replaced by the bitter taste of imperial necessity. By 295 AD, the visual evidence of the tax system's impact was undeniable. Across the empire, once thriving cities showed the same telltale signs. Empty market squares where merchants once displayed goods, shuttered workshops where artisans once practiced their crafts, abandoned villas where the wealthy once lived before fleeing to avoid tax assessment. The contrast was stark and unavoidable. Rome itself grew more magnificent even as the provinces were stripped bare. The marble facades of new imperial buildings gleamed white in the sun, built with taxes extracted from communities that could no longer afford to maintain their own basic infrastructure. The empire was cannibalizing itself to feed its capital. Entire industries were disappearing from the visual landscape. In Gaul, the famous pottery workshops that had supplied tableware across Europe fell silent. Their kilns grew cold not from lack of demand, but because the tax on clay, fuel, glazes, and finished products made production economically impossible. The landscape itself was changing as economic activity ceased. They're starting to realize their mistake. Provincial administrators were filing reports that read like obituaries for their own regions. The marketplaces stand empty, wrote the governor of Syria in 296 AD. Not from lack of goods, but from lack of people who can afford to buy or sell under current tax requirements. Remember, the original goal was to fund the imperial military? Now entire legions were being withdrawn from productive regions because there was no longer enough economic activity to support them. The tax system designed to strengthen the empire was systematically destroying the foundations of imperial power. They have no idea that this is only the beginning. What made the situation worse was how the decline spread through interconnected trade networks. When pottery production ceased in Gaul, the merchants who transported those goods lost their livelihood. When those merchants stopped travelling, the inns and stables they frequented closed. When those businesses failed, entire towns that had existed to serve the trade routes simply emptied out. The visual transformation was irreversible. Travellers along roads that had once bustled with commerce now saw ghost towns, abandoned farms, and forests reclaiming what had been cultivated land. The infrastructure of civilization, roads, bridges, aqueducts, began to crumble as local communities lacked the resources to maintain them, and imperial attention focused on extracting rather than building. By 300 AD, the sounds of the Roman Empire were changing in ways that terrified those who remembered the old world. Instead of the bustling noise of markets, the clatter of workshops, and the conversations of prosperous citizens, the empire echoed with different sounds. The tramping of tax collection armies, the wails of families being assessed beyond their ability to pay, and most ominously, the growing silence where economic activity had simply ceased. The catastrophe is now unstoppable. Remember Diocletian's original goal? To create a comprehensive system that would fund imperial defense? By now, the tax system was consuming more resources than the military it was supposed to support. The sound of imperial administration had become louder than the sound of the civilization it was meant to protect. The acoustic landscape told the story of collapse. In cities that had once hummed with industry, the dominant sound became the scratching of bureaucratic pens recording the absence of taxable activity. Tax assessors were literally documenting the death of the economy they were trying to tax. Their reports grew longer even as the activity they described grew smaller. The sound that haunted imperial conferences was seven. The absence of tax revenue from regions that had simply stopped participating in the monetary economy. Entire provinces were returning to subsistence agriculture, barter systems, and local self-sufficiency. They weren't reselling against Rome, they were just ignoring it. What Romans were hearing across the empire was the sound of civilization unwinding. The rhythmic hammering from blacksmith shops ceased as metal tools became impossible to tax profitably. The voices of merchants haggling in marketplaces faded as trade became economically unfeasible. Even the sound of children playing in streets diminished as families fled taxation by abandoning their communities entirely. Even as the evidence mounted, tax rates increased every year. The imperial response to declining revenue was always the same: raise tax rates, expand tax categories, increase enforcement. The sound of the empire's death throes was being recorded meticulously by the very bureaucrats who were causing it. The distinctive smell of imperial collapse was spreading across the known world, though few recognized it at the time. It wasn't the smell of war or plague, it was the odour of economic stagnation. Abandoned workshops filled with the musty scent of unused tools. Empty granaries reeked of waste as crops rotted because the tax on transport made distribution impossible. What administrators were now smelling was the scent of societal breakdown. This comprehensive taxation had created something unprecedented in Roman history, regions where people preferred barbarian rule to Roman administration. The Germanic tribes invading the empire were often welcomed as liberators from the tax system. The smell of social collapse was literal and unmistakable. Cities that had once been perfumed with spices from distant trade routes now stank of poverty and abandonment. The aroma of prosperity, fresh bread, quality wine, imported goods, was being replaced by the acrid smell of desperation and the musty odour of buildings falling into disrepair. Every solution creates bigger problems. Imperial attempts to solve the revenue crisis only made the smell of decline stronger. When tax collection became militarised, the provinces began to smell like occupied territories rather than integrated parts of the empire. When enforcement became violent, the smell of fear overpowered any remaining traces of Roman civilization. The tax system was consuming the empire's social fabric. In regions where tax resistance was strong, Roman authorities responded with such brutality that they destroyed the loyalty that had held the empire together for centuries. Citizens who had been proud Romans for generations began to identify more with their local communities than with imperial authority. The medical response will make everything worse. By 305 AD, Diocletian's successors were applying even more aggressive taxation policies to solve the revenue shortfall. The empire was trapped in a death spiral. Declining economic activity reduced tax revenue, which prompted higher tax rates, which further reduced economic activity, which reduced revenue even more. Even as the empire approached total fiscal collapse, imperial records continued to document the success of the tax system with meticulous precision. The texture of imperial denial was palpable. Bureaucrats produced increasingly elaborate reports proving that their policies were working, even as the civilization they governed had crumbled around them. The medical establishment begins the cover-up. Imperial historians were already rewriting the narrative to blame external factors, barbarian invasions, climate change, moral decay, for problems that were clearly caused by fiscal policy. The texture of official documents from this period reveals a systematic effort to avoid acknowledging the role of taxation in imperial collapse. While administrators publicly celebrated their efficient tax collection, they were privately fleeing the empire they had destroyed. Many of the same officials who had designed the comprehensive tax system used their positions to extract wealth and escape to regions beyond imperial authority. They were abandoning the sinking ship they had deliberately scuttled. The solution became creating an even more oppressive system. Constantine's reforms in the 310s made Diocletian's taxation look moderate by comparison. Hereditary tax obligations were introduced, binding families to specific locations and professions for generations. Citizens couldn't change careers, move to different cities, or even marry outside their tax categories without imperial permission. Diocletian's simple decision to create comprehensive taxation had created the template for the collapse of every overextended empire that followed. The texture of late imperial administration, desperate, brutal, self-defeating, would be repeated by every government that tried to solve the fiscal crisis through ever more comprehensive taxation. The Roman tax system had become a machine that consumed civilization to perpetuate itself. Families that had been Roman citizens for centuries found themselves reduced to subsistence farmers bound to the land by tax obligations. The empire had transformed from a system that protected and enriched its citizens into one that systematically impoverished them. The official imperial histories written after 400 AD barely mention the role of taxation in Rome's collapse. They focus on barbarian invasions, moral decay, and the rise of Christianity while glossing over the economic policies that made collapse inevitable. Medieval chroniclers, many of whom were supported by the same type of centralized authority that had destroyed Rome, perpetuated the myth that external factors, rather than internal policies, caused imperial collapse. Government records from the late imperial period were systematically destroyed or lost, making it difficult for later historians to trace the direct connection between tax policy and civilizational collapse. The few surviving documents show a clear pattern. Regions with the heaviest tax burdens were the first to welcome barbarian conquest and the last to resist imperial decline. This pattern of fiscal overreach, followed by institutional denial and historical revision, would repeat throughout European history. The collapse of Carolingian Empire, the crises of late medieval kingdoms, and the fiscal catastrophes that preceded virtually every major political transformation. This is how history chose to remember it, as barbarian conquest rather than fiscal suicide. The same pattern of comprehensive taxation, economic destruction, and institutional denial would repeat with every empire that tried to solve its problems by consuming the wealth of its citizens. Diocletian's tax system had taught future governments how to destroy themselves while maintaining detailed records proving their wisdom. And we're still following the same script today. Subscribe to Snooze History for more journeys through the past that comfortable narratives don't want you to discover. Each video reveals another layer of suppressed knowledge that will make you question everything you thought you knew. And if this video helped you fall asleep while becoming disturbingly more informed, leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is, and let us know which dark historical truth you'd like us to uncover next. Sweet dreams.